The wind had no mercy. It was a living thing in that part of the country. A bitter, howling beast that swept down from the gray teeth of the mountains and scoured the plains until they were raw and brown. It stripped the warmth from a person's bones, flayed the hope from their heart, and left nothing but the hard, cold truth of survival. The sky, a bruised and colorless sheet of iron, promised a winter that would be just as cruel. It was under this unforgiving sky that Clara Mae Thompson walked, leading a string of 6 weary horses. Each gust of wind felt like a physical blow, cutting through her threadbare wool coat and shawl as if they were made of lace. Her face was numb, her lips chapped and split, and her hands, clutching the stiff leather lead rope, were a mottled red and blue. The horses drooped their heads, their own coats ruffled and dull with dust and exhaustion. They were all she had left of her husband, Silas. Not a memory of love, not a treasured keepsake, but a string of half-decent cow ponies he'd won in a poker game 2 weeks before a poorly braced mine shaft had collapsed and made her a widow at 24. Silas had been a man of grand dreams and flimsy follow-through. He'd promised her a life in California, a home with an ocean view, but they'd never made it past the territories. Now he was buried in a bleak, windswept cemetery, and she was left with his final, unintended legacy: 6 animals that needed food and shelter as desperately as she did. For a month, she had been moving, always moving, trading what little she had for hay and oats, for a piece of bread and a slice of salt pork. She was heading north, chasing a rumor of work, of a place where a woman with a strong back and a willingness to work might find a foothold. But the rumor was as thin as the morning frost. Every ranch she approached, every small homestead with a curl of smoke promising life within, met her with the same hardened suspicion. The first had been a man named Jebediah Smith, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and mistrust. He'd stood on his porch, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm, and listened to her plea. "A woman alone, with 6 head of horse?" he'd grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that froze almost as it hit the ground. "What happened to your man?" "He passed, sir, a mining accident." "And you expect me to believe that? More likely you ran off, or he ran off from you." His eyes had roamed over her, not with pity, but with a kind of weary accusation. Women alone were trouble. They were either running from something or looking to cause it. He'd sent her away with a shake of his head. "Got no room for strays, not the 2-legged kind." The next place, a larger spread with a proper painted house, had been worse. The woman of the house, Mrs. Albright, had answered the door. Her hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. She'd looked at Clara's wind-chafed face, her worn dress, and the horses behind her, and her lips had thinned into a bloodless line. "We are a God-fearing family, Miss," she'd said, her voice as crisp and cold as the air. "We don't take in travelers." The word hung there, heavy with implication. It meant drifter. It meant harlot. It meant everything Clara was not, but in the woman's eyes, it was all she could ever be. She had closed the door softly, but the click of the latch had been as final as a gunshot. Rejection after rejection had worn her down, chipping away at the small reserve of courage she had clung to since Silas's death. The world, it seemed, was not built for a woman on her own. It had no place for her. She was a puzzle piece that didn't fit, a disruption to the harsh, simple order of things. Men had their place, and women had theirs, and a woman's place was beside a man. Without one, she was nothing but a ghost, a whisper of bad luck. Now, hunger was a gnawing ache deep in her belly, and a dizzying weakness was beginning to overtake her. The sun, a pale coin in the gray sky, was sinking toward the horizon, offering no warmth, only the threat of a night that promised a deeper, more permanent cold. Her legs trembled with each step. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she couldn't last another night in the open. The horses, too, were at their limit. One of them, a gentle mare with a white blaze, stumbled, its knees nearly buckling, Clara stopped and leaned her forehead against the mare's dusty neck, the animal's weary warmth a small comfort. Tears froze on her eyelashes.
"I'm sorry,"
she whispered, her voice a raw croak.
"I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to do."
She was about to sink to the ground, to simply give up and let the cold take her, when she saw it. Set back from the trail, nestled in a shallow dip in the land that offered some small protection from the wind, was a cabin. A thin ribbon of smoke, gray against the gray sky, rose from its stone chimney. It was a stark and lonely sight. A single, solid structure in a sea of brown grass. No frills, no painted porch, no sign of a woman's touch. Just a main cabin, a sturdy-looking barn, and a web of corrals. It looked like the end of the world, or perhaps a last chance. Summoning the last of her strength, she straightened up and pulled on the lead rope, her boots stumbling over the frozen ruts in the trail. As she drew closer, she saw a man. He was standing by the corral, his back to her, pitching hay to a few of his own cattle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a slow, deliberate economy that spoke of immense strength and a life of hard labor. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. He didn't seem to notice her until she was almost upon him, when he finally turned, alerted by the soft nicker of one of his cows. His face was as stark and weathered as the landscape around him. It was a quiet face, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble, and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. There were lines etched around them, not from laughter, but from squinting into the sun and the wind. He looked at her, then at her horses, and his expression gave nothing away. It was not unkind, but it was not welcoming either. It was simply watchful. "Mr. Clara began, her voice failing her. She cleared her throat and tried again, the words scraping their way out. "Mister, I need help. My horses. We need a place to shelter, just for the night. I can pay. I can work." The man said nothing for a long moment. His gaze was steady, assessing. It moved over her wind-whipped hair, her thin coat, the desperation plain on her face. He looked at the horses again, his eyes lingering on their condition, tired, but not starved, worn, but from good stock. A horseman could see that. She held her breath, expecting the familiar shake of the head, the cold dismissal. Her vision started to swim, the edges turning dark. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She must have swayed, for the man took a half-step toward her, his posture shifting from passive observation to quiet alert. Still, he did not speak. He simply watched her, as if waiting to see if she would fall. "Please," she whispered, the last of her pride crumbling into dust. "I have nowhere else to go." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was barely a movement. But for Clara, it was as if the sun had broken through the clouds. He gestured with his head toward the barn. "They can go in there," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a riverbed. It was a voice unused to conversation. "There's an empty stall, water in the trough." Relief washed over Clara so intensely it almost buckled her knees for good. "Thank you," she breathed, the words thick with unshed tears. "God bless you. Thank you." She turned to lead the horses, her hands fumbling with the rope. The man, Jack, as she would later learn his name was, walked ahead of her, his long strides eating up the ground. He didn't offer to help with the animals, but he slid open the heavy barn door, the wood groaning in protest. The air inside was warmer, thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay, animals, and dry earth. It was the most welcoming scent she had encountered in a month. He watched her as she settled the horses, his silence a heavy presence in the dim light of the barn. He pointed to a stack of hay bales in the corner. "They can have what they need." "I'll work it off," she said quickly, her voice stronger now that she was out of the wind. I'm a hard worker. I can mend, cook, clean. He gave another one of his slight nods. There's a cot in the tack room. It's dry. Better than sleeping out. He turned and pointed to a small, windowless room off to the side, where saddles and bridles hung on wooden pegs. Stay there. And with that, he left, disappearing back into the unforgiving twilight, leaving her alone in the quiet company of the animals. Clara leaned against the rough wood of the stall and finally let the tears come. Silent tears of gratitude and exhaustion that traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She had found shelter. It was not a home, not a welcome, but it was shelter. And for now, that was more than enough. For the first few days, a quiet, unspoken rhythm established itself. Jack was a man who lived by the sun and the seasons, his life a steady loop of chores that began before dawn and ended long after dusk. He rose in the dark, and the first thing Clara would hear was the clang of the pump as he drew water, followed by the rhythmic thud of his axe-splitting firewood. He moved about his land with a solitary grace, a man perfectly in tune with his harsh environment, true to her word. Clara worked. She woke with him, though she stayed in the barn until she saw the lamp in his cabin window dim, a sign that he had finished his breakfast and was heading out. She dared not intrude on his personal space. The main cabin was his fortress of solitude, and she understood, without him ever saying a word, that she was not invited in. Instead, she took over the tasks she could. She mucked out the stalls, brushed down her own horses until their coats shone, and even tended to his lone milk cow. Her request to cook had been met with a hesitant pause. He seemed to subsist on a diet of coffee, bacon, and hard biscuits. The idea of someone else in his kitchen clearly unsettled him. "I can leave a plate on the porch," she had offered, sensing his reluctance. "You don't even have to see me." He had considered this, his gaze distant. Finally, he'd nodded. All right. So, she cooked in his kitchen while he was out on the range, a ghost in his house. The first time she'd stepped inside, she was struck by its Spartan cleanliness. It was a man's space, devoid of any softness. A sturdy table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a bed neatly made in the corner, and a shelf with a handful of books. There were no pictures, no curtains on the window, nothing to suggest a past or a connection to anyone. It was the home of a man who was not just alone, but profoundly solitary. She cooked her meals, simple stews and breads, and, as promised, left his portion on a tin plate on the porch railing before retreating to the barn. Every morning, the plate was gone. It was their only form of communication. He never thanked her, but one afternoon, she found a stack of clean, mended blankets and a small bar of soap sitting just inside the barn door. It was his way of acknowledging her, a silent transaction of work for keep. She accepted it in the same spirit, a quiet gratitude that required no words. Despite his distance, she found herself watching him. She watched him from the barn doorway as he broke a new horse, his movements firm but gentle, a silent language passing between man and beast. She saw the way he'd stand on the rise behind the cabin at sunset, looking out over the vast, empty land that was his kingdom. He was a part of it, as rugged and enduring as the mesas in the distance. He was a man carved from the very rock and soil of the West. After a week, a trip to the nearby town of Redemption was necessary for supplies. Jack announced it not with a question, but a statement. "Going to town. Need anything?" he'd asked, his voice rough from disuse. It was the most he'd said to her at one time. "No, sir, I'm fine," she'd replied. He hitched up his wagon and left without another word. When he returned hours later, as he was unhitching the team, he tossed a small cloth sack onto the ground near her. Inside was a bag of flour, a slab of bacon, and a small tin of coffee. He had bought her own supplies, separating her keep from his charity. The gesture was both kind and distancing, a reminder that their arrangement was temporary, a business transaction. But his trip had consequences. News in a place like Redemption traveled faster than a prairie fire. The sight of the stoic, solitary Jack McIntyre buying supplies for two was enough to set tongues wagging in the general store. A lone woman living at his ranch? The story wrote itself, and it was never a flattering one. The gossip reached Clara a few days later, carried by the wind and a circuit preacher who stopped for water, the man of God. A portly fellow named Reverend Blackwood looked at Clara with eyes that held more judgment than piety. The good people of Redemption are concerned. Mrs. Thompson, he'd said, refusing to meet her gaze directly. A young widow, living unchaperoned on a bachelor's ranch. It gives rise to talk. I work for my keep. Reverend, Clara had said, her voice steady, though a hot flush of shame crept up her neck. Mr. McIntyre has offered me shelter. Nothing more. Of course, the preacher had soothed, though his tone suggested he believed the opposite. But you must understand appearances. Men can be weak, and a comely woman in distress. It is a powerful temptation. The preacher's words stung, but what followed hurt more. She began to feel the weight of unseen eyes. A neighbor riding the fence line would linger a moment too long, his stare insolent. A delivery man from town would make a crude joke. They had all painted her with the same brush, a conniving widow, using her looks and her tragedy to ensnare a lonely rancher. They stripped her of her grief, her struggle, and her dignity, and remade her into a caricature, a seductress. The shame of it made her retreat even further into herself. She kept her head down, her world shrinking to the confines of the barn and the corral. But the gossip also changed something between her and Jack, or perhaps it only made her notice what was already there. She began to feel his eyes on her. It wasn't like the stares of the other men, crude or pitying. Jack's gaze was different. She would be hanging laundry on the line, the wind whipping the sheets around her, and she would feel it, a stillness in the air that told her he was watching from the cabin window. She would be brushing down the mare, her hands moving in long, soothing strokes, and she would look up to see him paused in his work by the woodpile, his axe held forgotten in his hand, his eyes fixed on her. The look was unreadable, masked by that habitual stoicism. But it was no longer the detached assessment of a stranger. There was a depth to it now, a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. Pity was what you gave to a lame horse or a starving dog. This was something else entirely. It was a focused, intense observation, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle, to understand the woman who had so unexpectedly appeared in his ordered, solitary world. And in his gaze, Clara felt a strange, unwelcome stirring within herself. It was a feeling she thought had been buried with Silas, a faint warmth in the frozen landscape of her heart. The knowledge that he was watching her, truly seeing her, was both terrifying and thrilling. It made her acutely aware of the way her hair came loose from its pins and blew across her face, of the curve of her back as she bent to lift a bucket, of the simple fact of her own body. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from the iron sky, she was bringing in the milk when she saw him standing on the porch. He wasn't looking out at the land. He was looking directly at her as she walked from the barn. He didn't move or speak as she approached. She kept her eyes on the ground, her cheeks burning, acutely aware of the short distance between them. As she stepped onto the porch to leave the milk pail, her arm brushed against his sheepskin coat. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, sharp and unexpected. She pulled back as if burned. "Excuse me?" she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Jack didn't answer. She chanced to look up at him. In the fading light, his face was all shadows and angles, but his eyes caught the last of the daylight, and for the first time, she saw it clearly. A raw, unguarded emotion in their stormy depths. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was a profound and unsettling loneliness, a hunger that seemed to mirror the one she kept hidden in her own heart. And in that shared silent moment, Clara knew that the shelter he had offered was no longer a simple arrangement. It had become something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Winter did not arrive softly. It descended like a verdict. The first snows were a prelude, a dusting of white that melted by noon. But then came the real storm. It blew in from the north without warning, a wall of white that swallowed the mountains and then the plains. The wind became a physical force, driving ice pellets that stung any exposed skin and rattled the cabin's lone window like a fist demanding entry. For 3 days, the world shrank to the dimensions of Jack McIntyre's ranch, and then smaller still, to the paths shoveled between the cabin, the barn, and the woodpile. Life, already pared down to its essentials, became even more so. The rhythm of the days was dictated by the needs of the animals and the ferocity of the cold. Each morning was a battle. Breaking the ice on the water troughs required a heavy axe, and the water drawn from the pump steamed in the frigid air. The work was relentless and bone-deep hard, but Clara found a strange solace in it. Her muscles, once soft, were now hard and defined. Her hands, though chapped and calloused, felt capable. Every bucket of water she carried, every stall she mucked, every log she hauled for the fire was an honest act. It was a simple, brutal equation. Work equaled survival. There was a purity in the exhaustion that settled over her each night. It was a clean fatigue, earned and straightforward, a world away from the soul sickness that had defined her marriage to Silas. With him, life had been a series of anxieties, the fear of his temper after a losing night, the shame of unpaid debts, the hollow loneliness of lying next to a man who saw her as another one of his possessions. Here, in this vast, frozen silence, there was no pretense. The land didn't care about her past or her looks. It demanded respect and strength, and in meeting its demands, Clara was slowly finding her own. She began to love the stark beauty of it all. She loved the way the morning sun, when it finally broke through the clouds, would set the snow-covered plains ablaze with a light so pure and bright it hurt the eyes. She loved the silence, a profound quiet broken only by the cry of a hawk or the lowing of the cattle. She found herself breathing more deeply, as if her lungs, constricted for years by disappointment, were finally expanding. She was no longer a visitor waiting to be sent away. The calluses on her hands were proof that she belonged, that she was earning her place one grueling day at a time. The blizzard that changed everything began on a Tuesday. The sky had been a low, oppressive sheet of gray all morning, and the air held a heavy, waiting stillness. Jack had stood on the porch after his midday meal, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon, sniffing the air like an animal sensing a predator. "It's a big one," he'd stated, not to her, but to the land itself. "Check the latches on the barn. Bring in extra wood." By late afternoon, the first flakes were falling, thick and wet. Within an hour, the world was a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked, a high, keening wail that seemed to seep through the very logs of the cabin. Drifts began to pile up against the barn doors, and the path between the two buildings became a treacherous, knee-deep trench. Clara had just finished bedding down the horses for the night, the warm, animal-scented air of the barn a welcome refuge. She was about to retreat to her cold cot in the tack room when the main cabin door creaked open, cutting a swath of yellow light into the swirling darkness. Jack stood silhouetted against the lamp glow. "You'll not make it back and forth," he yelled over the roar of the wind. His words were snatched away almost as soon as they left his mouth. "The tack room will be frozen solid by morning. Stay in here, by the fire." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command born of practicality. To refuse would be foolish, even dangerous. Hesitantly, she trudged through the deepening snow, her shawl pulled tight over her head, and stepped into the cabin for the first time at night. The small space felt entirely different. The fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller, more intimate. The howling of the storm outside seemed to amplify the quiet within. Jack was already settled in one of the 2 chairs by the fire, a tin mug of coffee in his hands. He gestured with his head to the other chair. She took it, feeling awkward and out of place, an intruder in his sanctuary. She wrapped her cold hands around the mug of hot coffee he passed her, the warmth a welcome shock. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the logs and the relentless assault of the wind. It was a heavy silence, thick with unspoken thoughts. The carefully constructed distance they had maintained for weeks had been erased by the storm, and neither of them knew the new rules. "That mare," Jack said suddenly, his voice startling her.
The one with the blaze. She's got a good spirit.
Clara looked up, surprised. It was the first time he had ever initiated a conversation that wasn't about a necessary chore. "Her name is Daisy," she said, her voice soft. "Silas, my husband. He won her in a card game." She hadn't meant to say his name, it just slipped out. A ghost at the fireside. Jack said nothing, but his steady gaze was an invitation to continue. The warmth of the fire, the isolation of the storm. It all seemed to loosen something inside her, a knot of grief and shame she had held tight for so long.
"He was a gambler,"
she said, the words coming out in a quiet rush. She stared into the flames. Not at him. He wasn't a bad man, not really, just weak. He chased dreams, but he never wanted to do the work of building them. He always thought the next hand, the next claim, the next big score would be the one to set us up for life. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "It never was. It just dug us deeper into debt." "The horses?" Jack asked, his voice a low rumble. "They were his last big win. He won the deed to them from a man who couldn't pay his poker debts. Silas was so proud. He called them our ticket to a new life. He was going to start a breeding operation." She shook her head slowly, the firelight catching the sad curve of her lips. 2 weeks later, he was gone. He got into an argument with the same man he'd won them from. It was over a new game, a new debt. It turned into a fight. Silas, he hit his head on the corner of the bar. It was just a stupid, pointless end to a life full of stupid, pointless chances. She finally risked a look at him. His face was unreadable in the flickering light, his expression impassive. But he was listening. She could feel the focused intensity of his attention. It made her want to tell him the rest, the part she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "They aren't a legacy, Mr. McIntyre. They're a debt. The man he fought, Mr. Gable, he said Silas had wagered them back and lost just before the fight. He had no proof, but he spread the story all the same. That's part of why no one would help me. They see me and they see Silas's bad luck, his bad debts. They see these horses and think they belong to another man." She took a shaky breath. "I'm not just a widow. In their eyes, I'm a thief, running with stolen property." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. She expected him to shift uncomfortably, to offer some empty words of comfort, or worse, to look at her with the same judgment she saw in everyone else's eyes. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his gaze never leaving her face. He absorbed her story into his own vast silence. He let the quiet stretch for a full minute before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was lower, rougher than before. "War is a kind of debt, too," he said, looking past her and into the fire as if seeing something else entirely in the flames. "You survive, but you don't come back whole. You leave pieces of yourself on the battlefield, and you carry ghosts home with you in their place." Clara watched him, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. The firelight carved deep lines into his face, revealing a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. It was a wound deep in his soul. "You were a soldier?" she asked softly. He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "For a time. Fought down south. I saw things a man isn't meant to see. You're trained to kill, to survive at all costs. They teach you how to fire a rifle, how to dress a wound, how to march until your feet are bloody stumps. But they don't teach you how to live with it afterwards. They don't teach you how to sleep through the night without hearing the screams. They don't teach you how to sit in a quiet room and not feel the ghosts of the men who didn't make it back, standing right behind your chair. His voice was a flat, emotionless monotone, but the pain beneath it was a living thing. She could feel it radiating from him, a coldness that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She finally understood the reason for his solitude. It wasn't misanthropy. It was self-preservation. He had built this ranch, this fortress of silence, to keep the world out, but also to keep his own demons in. "You live with it," he went on, his voice barely a whisper. "But it changes you. It makes you unfit for other people. You get used to the quiet. You forget how to talk. You see the darkness in things. You can't just be." In his confession, she heard an echo of her own loneliness, her own feeling of being irrevocably set apart from the rest of the world. His wounds were deeper, more terrible than hers, but they came from the same place of loss and trauma. He was not a hard, unfeeling man. He was a man who felt too much, who had been shattered and had painstakingly pieced himself back together into the stoic, solitary shape she knew, without thinking, moved by a wave of empathy so powerful it overwhelmed her caution. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. The contact was electric, through the rough wool of his shirt. She could feel the rigid wall of his muscles, tense and unyielding. It was the first time she had touched him with deliberate tenderness, a simple, human gesture of comfort, an acknowledgement of his pain. For a heartbeat, he froze. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. She felt the tremor that went through him, a seismic shock that started in his shoulder and seemed to vibrate through his entire body. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with a sudden, terrifying energy. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and in the space of that single touch, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached up with his own hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he closed them around her wrist. He did not shove her hand away. He simply lifted it from his shoulder and placed it back in her own lap. The entire motion was precise, controlled, and utterly devastating in its finality. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the firelight, casting her into shadow. He didn't look at her. He walked to the cabin's single window and stared out into the swirling maelstrom of white, his back a rigid wall of denial. "The fire needs more wood," he said, his voice a dead, flat thing. He was gone, vanished back into the storm, leaving her alone in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. The chair he had just vacated still held the impression of his body, but the warmth was already fading. Clara sat there for a long time, her hand resting in her lap, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. She had offered comfort, and he had rejected it. She had shown him her own wounds, and in return, he had shown her his, only to wall them off again. She felt a fool. She had misread everything. She had mistaken his shared vulnerability for an invitation, his loneliness for a need she could fill. She had crossed a boundary she hadn't even known was there. The hot shame she had felt under the preacher's judgmental gaze was nothing compared to the cold humiliation that washed over her now. She had confirmed every ugly rumor the townspeople whispered about her. The scheming widow, the lonely seductress. She couldn't stay in the cabin. She couldn't bear to be there when he returned. Grabbing her shawl, she fled, plunging back into the blizzard. The wind tore at her, the cold a brutal slap in the face, but it was nothing to the storm raging inside her. She stumbled into the dark, cold barn, the familiar scent of hay and horses doing little to soothe her, sinking onto a bale of hay in the darkness. She finally let the tears come. They were hot on her frozen cheeks, bitter tears of rejection and regret. She had offered a moment of human connection, and in return, he had left her more alone than ever before. The world was born anew in the night, buried and then cleansed by the storm, when Clara emerged from the barn in the pre-dawn chill. The sky was a pale, clean slate of pearl gray, and the land was an unbroken ocean of white. The wind had died, and the silence was absolute, as if the snow had muffled the very heartbeat of the world. But the pristine beauty of the scene offered her no comfort. It felt like a pristine cage, a beautiful tomb. Sleep had been a stranger, visiting only in short, fitful bursts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jack's face as he turned away, felt the ghost of his hand on her wrist, heard the finality in his voice. Humiliation was a physical ache, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. She had made a terrible mistake. She had offered a piece of herself, a moment of genuine empathy, and he had treated it like an unwanted intrusion. She had been a fool to think the fragile bridge they had built with their stories could bear the weight of a single touch. She would not make the same mistake again. There was only one thing to do. She had to leave. She moved with a quiet, grim purpose in the cold shadows of the barn. There wasn't much to pack: a spare dress, her mother's silver locket, a worn Bible. She saddled Daisy, her movements stiff and clumsy in the biting air. The other horses watched her, their warm breath pluming in the dim light. Leaving them was a pang of guilt, but she knew she couldn't manage all six on her own. Not now. She would take the mare and ride until she reached the next town, or the one after that. She would sell her, if she had to. She would do whatever it took to put this place, and the man who inhabited it, behind her. She was just about to lead Daisy out into the snow when a long shadow fell across the doorway. Jack stood there, blocking the pale morning light. He held something in his hands, a shape of worked leather and wood. He didn't speak, just watched her for a moment, his expression as unreadable as ever. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken words of the night before.
I was just exercising the mare,
she lied, her voice thin and brittle, her cheeks burned with the lie. Jack's gaze dropped to the small, pathetic bundle of her belongings tied behind the saddle. He didn't acknowledge her lie. He simply walked toward her, his boots crunching softly on the hay-strewn floor. He stopped a few feet away and held out the object he was carrying. It was a saddle. Not an old, worn thing from his tack room, but a new one. The leather was a rich, dark brown, oiled to a soft sheen and smelling of tannin and craftsmanship. The stitching was neat and strong, the seat deep and secure. It was a beautiful piece of work, sturdy and practical, built to last a lifetime. "The one you have is worn," he said, his voice a low gravel.
"The cinch is frayed. It's not safe for long travel."
Clara stared at the saddle, then at his face, her mind reeling. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had expected coldness, dismissal, perhaps a curt order to be on her way. She had not expected this gift.
I can't accept this,"
she stammered.
"It's too much."
"It's not a gift," he said, his tone flat. "It's a tool. You need to keep the horses, they're yours. But you need to learn to ride better, to be their master, not just their keeper." He laid the saddle over a nearby railing. "This will help." He turned to leave, his duty done, his message delivered in his own blunt, practical way. But something inside Clara snapped, a storm of emotion, gratitude, confusion, and a hot, fierce anger rose up in her throat. He could give her a thing, a piece of expensive leather, but he couldn't give her a single word of kindness or explanation. He could see that her cinch was frayed, but was blind to the fact that her spirit was, too.
"Why are you doing this?"
she called out, her voice sharp. He stopped in the doorway, his back still to her.
"Why give me this, only to treat me like a stranger?"
She pressed on, the words tumbling out.
"You push me away. You make me feel like a fool, like a charity case you've grown tired of. And then you give me this? What am I to you, Mr. McIntyre? Am I just another piece of broken equipment on your ranch to be mended and put to use?"
He turned slowly, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes, a flash of pain, or perhaps frustration. It's not like that, he said, the word sounding clumsy and inadequate.
Then what is it like? She cried, taking a step toward him. You can't just build a wall and expect me not to notice when you leave a gate open.
You can't share a part of your soul and then act as if we've never spoken. I won't be managed. Mr. McIntyre, I won't be kept at a distance that suits your comfort.
He had no answer for her. He just stood there, a silent, solitary man trapped behind a fortress of his own making. The flicker of emotion in his eyes was gone, replaced by the familiar, stony mask. He gave a slight shake of his head and walked away, leaving the new saddle sitting between them like a peace offering and a barricade all at once. Clara spent the day in turmoil. She unpacked her things, her resolve to leave shaken. His gesture had complicated everything. To leave now would seem ungrateful, childish. But to stay felt like accepting the terms of his silence, agreeing to live within the boundaries he set. By dusk, she had worked herself into a state of quiet fury. She would not be passive. She would not let his fear, or her own, dictate the course of her life. She had been a ghost in his house and a servant in his barn. Tonight, she would be a guest at his table. She spent an hour preparing the meal. She made a thick, hearty beef soup, rich with the last of the winter vegetables from his root cellar. She baked a small loaf of bread that filled the barn with a warm, comforting aroma. It was more than just a meal. It was a statement. She put a generous portion into his best bowl, the one she had seen but never used, and with her heart hammering against her ribs, she walked out of the barn and across the snow-dusted ground to the main cabin. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open and walked in. Jack was sitting at the table, cleaning a rifle, the metal parts laid out neatly on an oilcloth. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as she entered. He started to rise, a protest forming on his lips. "Don't," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Don't get up. I'm not leaving it on the porch tonight." She placed the steaming bowl on the table in front of him, along with the bread and a spoon. "We are going to eat together," she stated. It was not a request. "And we are going to talk, or we can just sit in silence, but we will do it in the same room." For a long moment, he just stared at her, then at the soup. A complex battle seemed to wage behind his eyes. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a surrender, he began to reassemble his rifle. When he was done, he propped it against the wall and pulled the bowl toward him. Clara took the seat opposite, her own hands trembling slightly as she broke off a piece of bread. They ate in silence at first, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the hostile, awkward quiet of the morning, but a fragile truce. The soup was hot and good, a comfort against the cold night pressing in at the window. When they were finished, Jack stood and disappeared into a dark corner of the cabin. He returned with a dusty bottle and 2 tin cups. "Whiskey," he said, setting them on the table. He poured a generous measure into each cup and pushed one toward her. She had never been much of a drinker, but she took it. The liquor was harsh and fiery, burning a trail of warmth down her throat. The heat spread through her limbs, loosening the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach. Jack took a long swallow from his own cup, his eyes never leaving her face. "The war," he began, his voice rough. "The man I told you about, the one whose ghosts I carry. His name was Elias. He was younger than me, just a boy, really, from a farm in Ohio. He used to talk about the girl he was going to marry, Susanna. He carried her picture in his coat pocket." He paused, swirling the whiskey in his cup. "We were pinned down in a peach orchard. The blossoms were all out, pink and white. It was the prettiest place I'd ever seen. And the ugliest, Elias, he got hit badly. He asked me to get the picture of Susanna for him. While I was reaching for it, a shell landed close by. It took him, and I was left holding her picture." He stared down into his cup. "When I got back, I tried to find her,
to give it to her, to tell her he loved her, but she had already married someone else, another soldier. She didn't want the picture. She didn't want the memory. She just wanted to forget. He looked up at Clara, and his eyes were filled with a profound, ancient pain. I learned then that sometimes the past is a disease, and getting too close to someone who's sick with it, you're bound to get infected. I came out here to be alone because I don't want to infect anyone else. Clara's heart ached for him, for the boy Elias, for the girl Susanna, for the terrible weight he had carried alone for so many years. You are not a disease. Jack, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You're a man who has been deeply wounded. There's no difference, he said flatly. In that moment, sitting across from him in the warm glow of the firelight, seeing the raw vulnerability he had hidden for so long, Clara was overwhelmed. The anger she had felt was gone, washed away by a powerful current of tenderness. This was the man behind the silence, behind the walls, a man of honor and pain, trying to protect the world from his own broken pieces. She didn't plan it. The impulse was born of the whiskey, the firelight, and the sudden, aching need to offer a comfort that words could not convey. She stood up, walked around the table, and stood before him. He looked up at her, his expression wary, questioning. She slowly leaned down and pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, tentative kiss, as light as a snowflake. It was meant as an apology for her anger, an absolution for his guilt, a hopeful prayer against the loneliness that filled them both. His lips were chapped and firm, and they tasted of whiskey and sorrow. For a second, he remained perfectly still, a man carved from stone. Then, a shudder went through him, and his lips softened, yielding to hers in a silent, surprised acceptance. A small, defeated sigh escaped him, and one of his hands came up to tentatively touch her waist. Emboldened, feeling a dizzying surge of hope, Clara deepened the kiss. She leaned into him, her fingers tangling in the thick hair at the nape of his neck. This was it, she thought. This was the bridge across the silence. But it was a bridge he was not ready to cross. As soon as her kiss turned from comfort to something more, something that hinted at desire, he stiffened. He grasped her shoulders, his grip firm but not rough, and gently pushed her back. He broke the kiss, his breathing ragged. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the wooden table, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped its edge. The silence that fell was more terrible than any that had come before. Clara's heart plummeted, her hope turning to ice in her veins. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a desperate, hunted look. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, painful rasp. "Don't," he said. "Don't offer yourself out of gratitude. Clara." His gaze was pleading. "I couldn't bear another mistake." The words hit her like a physical blow. Gratitude. He thought this was payment for the shelter, for the saddle. He thought she was cheapening herself, offering her body as a transaction. He didn't see the truth of the gesture, that it came from a place of genuine, aching affection. He had taken her most vulnerable offering and thrown it back in her face, twisted into something ugly and transactional. Another mistake. He was lumping her in with the ghosts of his past, another error in judgment to be regretted. A wave of shame so profound it made her physically sick washed over her. The blood drained from her face, and she felt herself swaying. She took a step back, then another. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She had laid her heart bare, and he had stomped on it. Without a word, she turned and fled. She ran from the cabin, from the scent of the soup and the whiskey, from the warmth of the fire that had promised so much and delivered only pain. She ran out into the freezing night, the cold air searing her lungs, the tears freezing on her face. She ran, not knowing where she was going, only knowing she had to get away from the man who had seen the worst in her when she had tried to offer him the very best of herself. A chasm of silence opened between them. wider and more profound than the snow-covered plains. The days that followed were a pantomime of coexistence. They moved through their chores in the biting cold, their paths occasionally crossing but their eyes never meeting. Clara would leave Jack's food on the porch again, a cold plate for a cold man. She would retreat to the barn, which had once felt like a haven but now felt like a prison cell, its rough walls echoing with his rejection. Her hurt was a hard, bitter stone in her chest. It had frozen over, much like the landscape around them, into a protective layer of ice. She performed her tasks with a mechanical efficiency, her face a carefully blank mask. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. She had offered him her heart, and he had handed it back, telling her it was nothing more than a payment of gratitude. The shame of it was a constant, burning coal. She had misunderstood everything. She was, and always had been, an object of his pity, a problem to be managed. Jack, for his part, retreated even deeper into his own solitude. He worked from dawn until long after dusk, driving himself with a relentless energy, as if physical exhaustion could silence the new, unwelcome turmoil in his soul. The quiet of his life, once a comfort, was now filled with the ghost of a soft kiss and the echo of a door closing on a fleeing woman. He had done what he thought was right. He had protected her from him, from the darkness he carried. He had stopped himself from making another mistake, from hurting someone the way he had surely hurt others in his past. But the rightness of his action brought him no peace. It only brought a deeper, more profound loneliness than he had ever known. He had pushed her away to save her, and in doing so had plunged himself into a colder, darker winter than the one raging outside. This fragile, frozen peace was shattered by the arrival of a man on a tired-looking roan. He was not a neighbor or a preacher. He was a stranger with a confident slouch and eyes that were too small and set too close together. He dismounted without being invited and swaggered toward the barn where Clara was currying one of her horses. "Well, well," he said, his voice oily and familiar. "Look what we have here. Little Clara May, playing rancher." Clara froze, the curry comb falling from her numb fingers. She knew that voice. Harlan Gable, the man Silas had fought with, the man who claimed ownership of her horses. "What do you want, Harlan?" she asked, her voice low and steady, belying the frantic hammering of her heart. "What do I want?" He chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "I want what's mine. I've come for my horses. Silas's debt is long past due." He looked around the tidy barn, a sneer on his lips. "Looks like you found yourself a comfortable new setup, a lonely old rancher with a soft spot for a pretty face." "These horses are mine," Clara said, taking a step back. "Silas won them fair and square." "Silas was a cheat and a drunk, and you know it," Gable shot back, his good old boy demeanor evaporating. "He wagered them back to me that night. I've got witnesses. Now, you can hand them over nice and easy, or I can go to the sheriff in redemption and tell him how you've been harboring stolen property." "How do you think that'll look? A lone widow shacking up with some hermit, living off stolen goods?" From the corner of her eye, Clara saw Jack emerge from the cabin. He stood on the porch, his face impassive, and began to methodically whittle a piece of wood, seemingly oblivious to the confrontation happening just yards away. A cold dread washed over her. He wasn't going to help. He was going to let this happen. This was, after all, her problem, not his. "You're a liar," she said to Gable, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Am I?" Gable took a menacing step toward her, his smile turning cruel. "There's an easy way and a hard way. Clara, I'd have thought a woman in your position would have learned to choose the easy way by now." He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her flesh like a vice. "Now, you're going to help me tie these leads together, and I'll be on my way." Clara cried out, a sharp sound of pain and surprise. She struggled against his grip, but he was too strong,
And that was the sound that broke the spell. On the porch, the whittling stopped. The small piece of wood dropped silently into the snow. Jack looked up, and the impassive mask was gone. His eyes, which had been distant and clouded, were now blazing with a cold, clear, and utterly lethal fire. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He moved with a terrifyingly calm deliberation, disappearing for a second back inside the cabin. When he re-emerged, he was holding his shotgun. He didn't raise it. He just held it, the long, dark barrels pointing at the ground. But the intent was unmistakable. He walked down the porch steps and approached them, each step heavy and measured in the snow. "Take your hand off her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the sharp finality of a cocking hammer. Gable looked up, startled, his bravado faltering for the first time. He saw the look on Jack's face, and his grip on Clara's wrist loosened. "Now, hold on, McIntyre," he stammered. "This is between me and the little lady here. It's a family matter. Her late husband, Silas, he was my brother-in-law. This is just a misunderstanding about some property." Jack stopped about 10 feet away. He still hadn't raised the gun, but his thumb had moved to rest near the hammers. "She is on my land. That makes it my business." His eyes flickered to Gable's hand, still loosely encircling Clara's wrist. "I will not say it again." Gable snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He held both his hands up in a gesture of mock surrender. All right. No need for that. Just trying to reclaim what's rightfully mine." "What's yours is the trail off my property," Jack said, his voice dropping even lower. "You have 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride. After that, I can't guarantee your horse will be the only thing carrying lead." The threat was delivered so calmly, so devoid of emotion, that it was more terrifying than any angry shout. Gable's face paled. He saw no bluff in the winter sky eyes of the man in front of him. He saw a man who had seen death before and was not afraid to dispense it. Without another word, he backed away, scrambled onto his roan, and spurred the animal into a frantic gallop, not looking back. Clara stood frozen, rubbing her bruised wrist, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Jack, who was still standing there, the shotgun held loosely in his hand, his eyes following Gable until he was a small speck on the horizon. He had protected her. He had defended her. A wild, foolish hope flared in her chest. But when he finally turned to look at her, his face was once again a cold, impenetrable mask. The fire in his eyes was gone, banked and hidden away. He gave her a short, sharp nod, as if to say the transaction was complete, and then turned and walked back to the cabin without a word, the shotgun once again just a tool in his hand. The wall between them was back up, higher and colder than ever. Harlan Gable, true to his nature, did not ride far before seeking his revenge. He went straight to redemption and into the warmth of the general store, where he spun a tale of woe and treachery. He told anyone who would listen that he was Silas Thompson's grieving cousin, who had come only to reclaim the family's horses from the clutches of a black widow seductress. He painted a lurid picture of Clara, the conniving temptress who had bewitched the poor, lonely rancher Jack McIntyre, turning him against her husband's own kin. He claimed Jack had gone mad, threatening him with a shotgun, completely under the woman's spell. The story spread through the town and the surrounding homesteads like a contagion. It confirmed every suspicion, every nasty whisper that had been circulating for weeks. The narrative was simple and satisfying. Clara was the villain, a Jezebel using her wiles to steal a good man's property and sanity. Jack was the victim, a fool blinded by a pretty face. The community, bound by the harsh codes of the frontier, closed ranks. Pity for the poor widow curdled into outright hostility. Jack felt the shift the next time he went to town for supplies. The usual curt nods from his neighbors were replaced by stony glares. Women pulled their children closer as he passed. In the store, the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, who had known Jack for years, served him with a cold formality.
his eyes full of accusation. A group of men by the stove fell silent when he entered, their low muttering full of words like shame and bewitched. Jack endured it with his usual stoicism, his face giving nothing away, but inside, a cold fury was building. He was not a man who cared for the opinions of others. He had spent years cultivating his isolation, but this was different. Their judgment was not just on him, it was on Clara. He had seen the way they looked at her, and now he had brought the full weight of their condemnation down upon her head. By protecting her, he had made her a pariah. He returned to the ranch that evening, the setting sun casting long, dark shadows across the snow. He found Clara by the corral, tossing hay to her horses, her shoulders slumped in a posture of weary defeat. He knew what he had to do. It was the only logical, practical solution. It was the only way to keep her safe, and it was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. She flinched at the sound of his voice, but didn't turn around. "I'm busy." "Clara," he said her name, and the single word was so full of weariness that it made her stop. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "I was in town," he said, getting straight to the point. "Gable has been talking. The story he's telling, it's not good. They think you're a thief. They think this arrangement is something it's not." "I don't care what they think," she said, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. "You should," he countered, his voice hard. "This is not a safe place for a woman to be on her own. And it's even less safe for one who has the whole county turned against her. More men like Gable will come. They'll see you as easy prey. They'll see this ranch as an easy target." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "You can't stay here anymore. Clara, it's not safe. You need to leave. Go east or south. Go somewhere no one knows your name or Silas's. Somewhere you can make a fresh start." Every word was a hammer blow against her heart. He was sending her away. After everything, after defending her, this was his solution. To cast her out, back into the wilderness. The foolish hope she had nurtured died a final, painful death. "So you're kicking me out," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "I'm trying to protect you," he insisted, a note of frustration creeping into his tone. "Protect me or protect yourself? Are you afraid the town's gossip will tarnish your good name? Mr. McIntyre," she shot back, her voice laced with a bitterness that surprised even her. "I don't give a damn what they say about me," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "This is about you." "Is it?" she whispered, her eyes searching his, pleading with him. "Then tell me the truth. All of this, taking me in, the saddle, chasing Gable away, was all of it just pity? Was that all it ever was between us?" It was the question that lay at the heart of everything. A simple question that demanded a simple answer. No, it was more. That's all he had to say. Just 4 words, and it would change everything. Clara held her breath, watching his face, praying. She saw the war in his eyes, the conflict that tightened his jaw and drew his brows together. She saw him open his mouth to speak, and then close it again. The silence stretched, screaming in the empty space between them. He could not say it. He would not say it. He was too afraid, too broken, too convinced of his own darkness to admit to the light she brought into his life. His silence was the answer. A single tear escaped her and traced a cold path down her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. "I see," she said, her voice utterly empty. She turned her back on him, unable to bear the sight of his face for a second longer. "I'll be gone in the morning." That night, she packed for the last time. She took the new saddle, its fine leather a cruel reminder of what she had mistaken for caring. It was a tool, he had said, and that's what she would use it as. A tool for her survival. She was a stray he had sheltered, a problem he had solved, and now, a liability to be disposed of. The next morning, a light snow was falling, the soft flakes dusting the world in a fresh coat of white. She led Daisy out of the barn, saddled and ready. She didn't look toward the cabin. She didn't want to know if he was watching from the window. With a heart that felt as cold and heavy as a river stone, she mounted the mare. She didn't look back. She rode east, into the gray dawn, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape, disappearing into the veil of falling snow. The silence was the first thing he noticed. He had lived in silence for years, had cultivated it, used it as a shield and a balm. It had been the sound of his own solitary strength, but the silence that descended after Clara rode away was a different entity entirely. It was a hollow, aching thing, a presence rather than an absence. It was the sound of a wound. For the first day, he told himself it was for the best. He had done the hard, necessary thing. He had sent her toward safety, away from the poison of his own past and the judgment of their neighbors. He worked with a brutal, punishing intensity, repairing a stretch of fence that didn't need it, splitting enough firewood to last through 2 winters. He was a man of logic. This was a logical solution. He repeated it to himself like a catechism, the words a hollow chant against the crushing quiet. But logic was a poor defense against the ghosts of her presence. When he walked into the cabin, it felt cavernously empty. He saw the chair where she had sat, the place at the table where he had finally broken bread with her. The air no longer held the faint, warm scent of baking or the clean fragrance of the soap he had given her. It smelled only of wood smoke, old leather, and his own profound solitude. It smelled like a tomb. The barn was worse. It was a constant, living accusation. Her 5 remaining horses watched him with their large, dark eyes, and in their silent regard, he imagined a judgment he could not escape. The empty space where Daisy, the little mare, should have been was a gaping hole in the fabric of his world. He had sent her out into the wilderness with a single horse, a new saddle, and a broken heart. He had called it protection. His conscience called it cruelty. By the 3rd day, the logical arguments had crumbled to dust. A cold, gnawing fear began to take root in their place. Another storm was gathering in the north, the sky turning the color of a fresh bruise. The wind was picking up, its low moan a prelude to a more vicious song. He pictured her out there, alone, with the snow falling. He saw her trying to make a cold camp, her hands numb, her spirit as battered as the landscape. He had sent her away to avoid trouble, but what if he had sent her to her death? The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. He could not stand it another moment. He saddled his own horse, a powerful buckskin that knew the land as well as he did, and set out. He told himself he was just going to make sure she had made it to the next settlement, that he would turn back as soon as he found her tracks on the main trail. It was a lie, and he knew it. He was going to find her. But the snow that had been falling as she left, the very snow that had seemed so soft and poetic, had been a traitor. It had covered her tracks completely. The plains were a vast, white, unwritten page. She could have gone in any direction. She could be anywhere. Panic, an emotion Jack had not felt since the battlefield, began to claw at him. He rode for hours, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for a curl of smoke, a speck of movement, anything. He circled his own land, then widened the circle, pushing the buckskin hard. The wind grew stronger, driving the snow into a stinging curtain of white, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. The world was closing in, and she was lost in it. He rode until his horse was lathered and trembling with fatigue, and he himself was numb with cold and a growing, sickening despair. He had failed. He had driven her away, and the wilderness had swallowed her whole. His solitude, once a choice, was now a life sentence, and his guilt was the warden. Clara had not ridden east for long. The idea of heading toward Redemption, or any other town, was unthinkable. To face the leering men and the judgmental women, to beg for shelter and be met with scorn, her pride would not allow it. Instead, she had turned north, into the teeth of the wind, seeking only to put distance between herself and the man who had shattered her. She rode until Daisy was stumbling with exhaustion and the cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she could no longer feel her feet in the stirrups. She found what she was looking for as dusk began to bleed across the gray sky. An old, abandoned line shack. Little more than a single room and an attached lean-to for a horse. It was a derelict place, the roof sagging, the door hanging from a single leather hinge, but it was shelter. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Inside, it was dark and smelled of decay and frozen earth, but it broke the wind. She settled Daisy in the lean-to, using the last of her strength to rub the mare down with a handful of dry grass she found in a corner. She gave the horse the last of her biscuits. She had nothing for herself. The cold of the following days was a relentless enemy. It was a living thing that crept through the cracks in the walls and settled deep in her lungs. She huddled under her single blanket, her body shaking with uncontrollable shivers. The small fire she managed to build with damp wood sputtered and smoked, offering little warmth and stinging her eyes. The ache in her heart had transformed into a physical malady, a heaviness in her limbs, a fire in her head. A fever took hold. Her world dissolved into a blurry, disjointed nightmare. She was back in the cabin with Jack, the firelight warm on her face, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. Then she was kissing him, feeling the brief, hesitant response before he pushed her away. "Don't offer yourself out of gratitude." The words echoed in her head, over and over, each time a fresh stab of pain. She was walking, lost in a blizzard, the wind whispering the townspeople's gossip. Seductress, thief, Jezebel. She was lying in the cold ground next to Silas, the weight of the earth pressing down on her. She lost track of time. Day and night bled into one another. Sometimes she would wake, her throat parched, and crawl to the doorway to scoop handfuls of snow into her mouth. She would see Daisy watching her from the lean-to, the mare's eyes full of a soft, worried concern, and the sight would give her the strength to hold on for another hour. But the fever was burning through her reserves, consuming her from the inside out. She was drifting away on a dark, hot tide, and she no longer had the strength to fight it. Jack found the shack on the 4th day of his search. He had ridden himself and his horse to the point of collapse, driven by a desperate, soul-deep certainty that he could not give up. He had found a single, faint horseshoe print in a patch of wind-scoured earth near a frozen creek bed. It was a long shot, but it was the only sign he had found. It led him north. He almost missed the shack. It was so dilapidated and blended into the snow-dusted landscape. But his horse nickered, its ears pricked forward, smelling the other horse hidden in the lean-to. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. He dismounted, his legs stiff and clumsy, and pushed open the groaning door. The sight that met him stopped his breath. Clara was huddled in a corner, wrapped in her thin blanket, her face flushed with fever, her lips cracked and pale. She was so still, so small against the vastness of the cold, that for one terrifying second, he thought he was too late. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. "Clara," he breathed, the name a prayer. He knelt beside her, his rough hand going to her forehead. She was burning up. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, looking through him rather than at him. "Cold," she whispered, her teeth chattering despite the heat of her skin. "So cold." All the walls he had ever built, all the logic, all the fear, it all crumbled to dust in that moment. There was only this: the woman he had sent away was dying in a frozen hut because of his own cowardice. He gently gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. She was a fragile bird, a broken thing. He wrapped her in his own thick sheepskin coat, burying her in its warmth, and carried her out into the snow. He mounted his horse, settling her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest, and then he turned for home. The ride back was a blur of wind and snow and a desperate, focused will. He held her tight, shielding her with his own body, whispering her name over and over into her hair.
as if the sound of it could anchor her to life. Back at the ranch, he carried her not to the barn, but into the cabin. He laid her gently on his own bed, the one she had never been invited to share. And then, the soldier took over. The part of him that he had tried to bury, the part that knew the grim mechanics of life and death, resurfaced not as a killer, but as a healer. He moved with a swift, practiced competence he hadn't known he still possessed. He stoked the fire until the cabin was a cocoon of warmth. He stripped off her damp, frozen clothes and dressed her in one of his own flannel shirts, the soft fabric swallowing her small frame. He melted snow for water and bathed her face and neck with a cool cloth, his movements gentle, efficient. He remembered the field hospitals, the rows of wounded and dying men, the desperate, futile work of staving off the inevitable. But this was not futile. He would not let it be. He brewed a thin broth and sat by her side for hours, patiently coaxing spoonfuls of it between her parched lips. He held her hand, his calloused fingers wrapped around her slender ones, willing his own strength into her. He sat vigil through the long, dark night, listening to her ragged breathing, watching the fever wage its war upon her body. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He just watched and waited and prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in a decade. Sometime in the deepest hour of the night, in the heart of the darkness, she began to murmur. Her words were a jumbled, feverish stream, fragments of memory and pain. She spoke of her husband, of the townspeople, of the cold, and then her voice grew clear, though it was no more than a whisper, a sigh of pure, heartbreaking sorrow. She turned her head on the pillow, her eyes still closed, as if searching for something in the darkness. "I don't want shelter," she breathed, the words so soft he had to lean close to hear them. "I want a heart, to stop at—" The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. They were the purest, most honest truth he had ever heard, and they shattered the last of his defenses. She had not been seeking a roof over her head, or a man's protection. She had been seeking a place to rest her soul, a place to finally stop running. She had been seeking a home, and he, in his blindness and his fear, had been unable to see it. He had offered her a barn when she was asking for his heart. A great, shuddering sob tore through him. It was a sound ripped from the deepest, most wounded part of his soul. He lowered his head into his free hand, and for the first time since he was a boy, for the first time since the peach orchard in the South, Jack McIntyre wept. Tears streamed through his fingers, hot and cleansing. He wept for the boy Elias, for the ghosts he carried, for the years he had wasted in self-imposed exile. He wept for his own foolish pride, for his cowardice. But most of all, he wept for the woman in his bed, the woman he had so terribly wronged, the woman he now knew, with a certainty that shook him to his very foundations, that he loved. He was still sitting there when the first pale light of dawn crept through the window. The fever had broken. Her skin was cool to the touch, her breathing deep and even. He had not lost her. Clara awoke slowly, drifting up from a long, dark dream. The first thing she was aware of was the warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that reached all the way to her bones. The second was the softness of a real mattress beneath her, the scent of clean flannel and wood smoke. Her eyes fluttered open. She was in Jack's cabin, in his bed. She turned her head and saw him sitting in the chair beside her, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, his face etched with lines of grief and fatigue she had never seen before. He had not shaved, and his jaw was dark with stubble. He looked broken. "Jack?" she whispered, her voice a dry, scratchy thing. His head snapped up. He looked at her, and his eyes, those stormy, guarded eyes, were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not pity. It was not guilt. It was something fierce and tender and overwhelming. He said nothing. He simply stood, leaned over the bed,
and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His touch was hesitant, reverent. He then lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the first kiss. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no fear. His lips were soft and sure, and they spoke a language of profound regret and boundless hope. It was a kiss that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was not the kiss of a lonely man taking what he could get, or a guilty man seeking absolution. It was the kiss of a man who had walked through the gates of his own personal hell and had come out the other side, finally, ready to love. It was a kiss that tasted of tears, and of promises, and of a heart. Finally, coming to a stop. Winter held the land in its grip, but inside the small cabin, a thaw had begun. Clara's recovery was slow, a gradual return of strength to her limbs and color to her cheeks. But as her body healed, something far more profound was mending within her soul. The cold, lonely woman who had stumbled into Jack McIntyre's life was being reborn in the warmth of his care. Those first days were a quiet testament to his devotion. He moved with a gentle reverence, a man unaccustomed to tenderness but fluent in its language. He bathed her brow, spoon-fed her broth, and read to her from one of his few worn books, his low, gravelly voice a soothing balm in the quiet room. He never left her side for long, as if afraid she might fade away if he looked away for a moment. He was no longer a solitary man. He was a guardian. As her strength returned, a new intimacy, fragile and yet powerful, bloomed between them in the fire-lit confines of the cabin. The wall of his silence had not just been breached, it had been demolished. In the long, dark evenings, with the wind howling its mournful song outside, they talked. He told her more about the war, not just the horror, but the camaraderie, the foolish jokes told in the face of death, the impossible green of the Virginia countryside. He spoke of his childhood on a hardscrabble farm in the mountains, of a father he respected but never knew how to love, and a mother whose laughter he could barely recall. He unburdened his soul, piece by painful piece, and she listened, her hand resting on his, offering the silent absolution he had been unable to grant himself. In turn, she told him of her own life, of dreams of being a schoolteacher, of a youth filled with more books than suitors. She spoke of the loneliness of her marriage to Silas, a deeper chill than any winter, and the quiet grief of a life unlived. These were not stories of self-pity, but simple, honest confessions, the sharing of scars that, when exposed to the light of another's empathy, began to lose their power. Their days were a rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship. She moved her few belongings from the barn into the cabin, and the small space, once so stark and masculine, began to soften. A jar of winter berries on the windowsill, a mended quilt draped over the back of her chair, small touches that turned a shelter into a home. They moved around each other with an unspoken grace, a comfortable dance of two people who understood the contours of each other's solitude. The nights were when the true depth of their connection was forged. The single bed became a sanctuary, an island of warmth in the vast, cold darkness. Their coming together was not a sudden, explosive passion, but a slow, tender exploration. It was the culmination of every shared story, every quiet glance, every moment of dawning trust. It was the touch of his calloused hand, so strong and yet so gentle, tracing the line of her jaw. It was the feel of her fingers, soft and hesitant, on the old, puckered scar on his shoulder, a wound he had never let another soul see, let alone touch. Their love-making was a conversation in a language beyond words. It was a fierce and tender dialogue of two people who had known profound loneliness and pain, who were now discovering the redemptive power of another's touch, in his arms. Clara felt cherished and safe, not as an object of pity or desire, but as a woman truly seen and valued. For Jack, holding her was like coming home after a lifetime at war. Her softness was a balm to his hardened soul, her quiet strength a mirror to his own. They were two halves of a fractured whole, and in the warmth of the winter nights, they began to piece themselves, and each other, back together. No preacher was ever summoned. No vows were spoken before God or the state. Their commitment was not written on a piece of paper filed away in the county courthouse. It was written in the daily acts of their lives. It was in the way he brought her the first purple crocus that pushed its way through the melting snow. It was in the way she mended his favorite shirt, her stitches small and neat. It was in the shared glance across the dinner table, a silent communication that spoke volumes more than any formal vow. They were a family, defined not by law or convention, but by the simple, unshakable truth of their devotion. The town of redemption, however, did not see devotion. It saw sin, as the snows melted and the trails became passable again. The gossip that had festered all winter erupted with renewed venom. The story of Jack McIntyre threatening Harlan Gable had become the stuff of local legend, and Clara was cast as the wicked enchantress, the siren who had lured the solitary rancher to ruin. She was no longer just a woman of loose morals. She was a home-wrecker, a property thief who had used her feminine wiles to steal a man's land and his soul. The reckoning came on a bright, wind-swept afternoon. A group of 4 men rode up to the ranch. They were led by Jedediah Smith, the first rancher who had turned Clara away, his face a mask of self-righteous authority. They sat on their horses just beyond the main corral, a silent, intimidating jury. Jack was repairing a harness on the porch. He saw them coming but did not stop his work, the rhythmic pull of his needle and all a steady, calming beat. Clara watched from the cabin window, her heart a cold knot of fear. "McIntyre," Smith called out, his voice carrying the weight of community condemnation. "We've come to talk." Jack set down his harness and stood up slowly. He didn't reach for the shotgun propped just inside the door. He simply stood, his hands empty, and waited. "There's nothing to talk about, Jedediah," Jack said, his voice calm and even. "We think there is," another man chimed in. "We're worried about you. Jack, this woman, she's brought a sickness to this valley. First, her husband's kin comes looking for what's his, and you run him off with a gun. Now, you're living in sin with her. It's not right. It brings shame on us all. You're living on my property," Jack stated, his voice flat. "What I do in my home is my concern." "It becomes our concern when you lose your honor," Smith spat, his face flushing with anger. "You were a good man, a solitary man, but a man of honor. Now you're nothing but a puppet for that woman. We're here to give you a choice. Send her on her way, and your slate is wiped clean with your neighbors. Keep her, and you'll find this is a lonely place to live when no one will sell you supplies, or help you at roundup, or pull your wagon out of a ditch." It was the ultimate frontier threat, excommunication. To be cast out, to be denied the support of the community, was a sentence of slow, grinding failure. Clara watched from the window, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw Jack's shoulders tense. This was it. This was the test he could not pass. He could not fight the whole county for her. She was not worth that. But Jack did not look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the men. He took a slow step forward, off the porch and onto the muddy ground of his yard. "This ranch," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "is my home. The woman in that cabin is my life. What you see as sin, I see as salvation. You are not welcome here. Your threats are not welcome here. And your judgment means less to me than the dust on my boots." He pointed to the trail leading away from his land. "This is the only warning you will get. Leave my property, and do not come back." He said nothing more. He simply stood there, a solitary, unmovable mountain of a man. His silence was more powerful than any weapon. It was the silence of absolute conviction, of a man who had drawn a line in the dirt from which he would not retreat. The 4 men looked at each other, their blustering anger deflating in the face of his iron will. They had come expecting to intimidate a fool bewitched by lust.
They had found a man defending the very core of his existence. After a long, tense moment, Jedediah Smith grunted, turned his horse, and led the others away, their righteous crusade ending in a quiet, humiliating defeat. When they were gone, Jack turned and walked back into the cabin. Clara was standing in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face. He went to her and gently wiped them away with his rough thumb. "You are not a sickness, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "You are the cure." Spring arrived in a riot of green. The plains, once brown and then white, were now covered in a carpet of new grass and wildflowers. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. The annual Founders' Day festival was to be held in Redemption, a day of horse races, bake sales, and community gathering. "We should go," Clara said one evening, the words a quiet challenge. Jack looked at her, understanding what she was asking. To go to the festival would be to walk directly into the lion's den, to face the scorn of the entire community. "Are you sure?" he asked. She nodded, a new strength in her eyes. "I'm not ashamed, Jack, not of you, not of us. I'm tired of hiding." He took her hand. "All right then, we'll go." When they arrived in town, a hush fell over the festive crowd. Conversations stopped, heads turned. The people parted before them as if they were lepers, their faces a mixture of cold stares and hostile whispers. Clara's courage wavered. She felt the blood drain from her face, and her hand instinctively tightened in Jack's. He squeezed it back, a silent, reassuring pressure. He did not flinch, did not look away. He met every glare with his own steady, impassive gaze, his head held high, leading her through the sea of judgment as if they were the only two people in the world. They were standing near the makeshift bandstand, a pocket of isolation in the midst of the celebration, when a small boy, no more than 4 years old, darted away from his mother and disappeared into the throng of legs. A moment later, a terrified wail erupted. The boy had tripped and fallen, and now sat in the middle of the dusty street, lost, scared, and crying his heart out. The crowd looked on, a few people pointing, the boy's mother trying desperately to push her way through, but before anyone else could move, Clara reacted. She let go of Jack's hand and was at the boy's side in an instant. She knelt in the dust, her clean dress forgotten, and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice. "There now, it's all right," she said, her voice full of a gentle, maternal warmth that cut through the boy's sobs. "You took quite a tumble. Let's have a look." She gently checked his scraped knee, her touch confident and kind. She wiped the tears from his face with the corner of her shawl. "That's a brave boy. There's nothing here a mother's kiss can't fix." The boy, mesmerized by her calm presence, had stopped crying and was now staring at her with wide, hiccuping eyes. Just then, his mother arrived, frantic and out of breath. "Oh, Thomas, thank you, Miss, thank you," she said, scooping her son into her arms. Clara simply smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "He's a brave one." She stood, brushed the dust from her dress, and walked back to Jack's side, slipping her hand back into his. It was a small thing, a simple act of kindness, but in that moment, the entire town of Redemption had seen not the conniving seductress of their gossip, but a woman of gentle compassion and quiet grace. They had seen her kneel in the dirt to comfort a child. The image was a powerful antidote to the poison they had been fed. Many of the women in the crowd, including Mrs. Albright, who had once closed her door in Clara's face, looked at her with a new, grudging respect. The narrative had been broken. They were not suddenly welcomed with open arms. They did not win a prize for the best apple pie. But as they walked through the festival for the rest of the afternoon, the glares had softened, the whispers had quieted. A few people even offered a hesitant, uncertain nod. They were no longer pariahs. They were just Jack and Clara, a quiet rancher and his woman, who had faced down the town's judgment and had refused to break. That evening, they stood on the porch of their cabin,
watching the sunset. It bled across the horizon in magnificent streaks of orange, pink, and purple, setting the vast plains on fire. The land that had once been a symbol of their individual loneliness was now the kingdom they shared. It was a harsh and beautiful country, and it had forged them into something harsh and beautiful, too. Clara leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, rich with understanding and a deep, abiding peace. "It's funny," she said softly, her voice full of wonder. "My whole life was one long winter." He tightened his arm around her, kissing the top of her head. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the dying light of the day, her face illuminated with a love so profound it took his breath away. "Just one kiss," she whispered. "It changed everything." Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and say hello. Your support means the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the frontier. And please share your thoughts on Clara and Jack's journey.